Yeah, basically we wanted to share this research with you because it's something that we've been working on since last year. As you can tell from our title, we are looking at issues around decolonisation, cultural justice and community identity, and how these come to interplay in enabling or challenging and hindering museum practice. So this is something that we're working on as a team, as a collaborative research project. Basically, we are focusing on the East Asia context, and the reason why we're doing this is because it is largely a context that is overlooked, particularly when it comes to museum decolonisation. So what are we hoping to get out of this? We are hoping to kind of offer some insights to museums, particularly of the West, and of British kind of museums, and how they might come to pursue efforts, more ethical and equitable efforts and practices grounded in universal, more universal understandings of cultural heritage. So it's about going beyond kind of the solely response of repatriation, the repatriation framework. And so we are hoping to kind of offer a more practical, context-sensitive and specific approach to museum decolonisation. In terms of the museum decolonisation is a very kind of prevailing issue, particularly within museum studies within recent years. However, it's also a source of high contention. So we've got theorists like Vargas coming out and questioning whether even Western museums can truly be decolonised. And this is a question that we often kind of think about, yet we don't necessarily have the answer to. And you have the theorists on the one hand and recent reports that have come out in recent years arguing for the links between museum decolonisation, repatriation and restitution of objects. Yet on the other side of the spectrum, you have those theorists who argue for the relevance of universal collections, particularly under the framework of national style museums. Yet we are not here to argue for the one or the other. Rather, we are here to kind of explore the grey area in between. So, looking at the UK context, we explored this quite extensively. We found out that UK-based museum associations, such as the Museum Association or the Collections Trust, have in recent years published guidelines around how museums and museum practitioners can come to decolonise their collections to address cause around decolonisation. Yet what we have found, this is a fairly recent kind of discussion happening. So I think the Museum Association was one of the first to publish such sector guidelines in 2018. And around the same time, we saw some national style museums, such as the British Museum and the V&A, organising decolonisation events. So the V&A specifically did a decolonisation conference. I think it was a day conference, inviting museum practitioners and museum academics to speak about appropriate responses to decolonising collections. So, but in terms of other reports that have come out as well, we see the Arts Council England came up with a restitution repatriation report in 2023 as well. So whilst we see a sector-wide willingness and eagerness to respond to decolonisation cause, this isn't necessarily kind of translating in practice. And this is because it is largely limited because of UK legislation. So we see national style museums, particularly like the V&A, being limited due to laws like the British Museum Act published in 1963 and the National Heritage Act published in 1983. And the work around this for the V&A has been long-term loans, so like the Head of Eros, which has been kind of lent out to one of the museums in Turkey. Other approaches is through co-creating collaborative exhibits as a way around kind of permanent, rather than a permanent repatriation returns of objects. And whilst this is described as a kind of practical, a pragmatic approach from the V&A, it is come under scrutiny by the public and by the source communities as being disingenuous and as being only partial in their decolonisation kind of response. Despite that, the V&A has developed a decolonisation strategy, and that's another reason why we have chosen to focus on the V&A as a case study. So they have published their mission and strategy online, and this is something that we have based our work extensively around this. And so we see that there is a commitment to creating and renewing cultural partnerships, as well as transparency, where these objects have come from, their history, their biographies. And one of the key actions that we've seen through this strategy is the online database that they've created. So they've got an online database with all the collections, and a lot of the time we see some kind of consideration of provenance as well. So I wanted to highlight that. As well, at the same time, we see a lot of the recent kind of temporary exhibits tend to take on a decolonisation mindset and use decolonisation language. This strongly aligns with the director, Tristan Hunt, of the V&A, who joined in 2017. The strategy, decolonisation strategy of the V&A was published around 2018. So we see there's clear connections, and he often has a very kind of clear understanding and position around museum decolonisation. He's published a number of Guardian articles around it and talks. Yet what he also kind of states, while he kind of highlights this need for museum decolonisation, he also highlights that just because other museums around the world ask for objects to be returned, it doesn't mean museums should automatically give in to it. So this shows kind of a very partial willingness for decolonisation, and has often come under scrutiny for this. And in extension, this reflects on the V&A's museum strategy around decolonisation. This is what we are exploring and also partially arguing as well. So I've included here the mission statement of the V&A. So we see that there is I wanted to kind of highlight this section where it's about there is a commitment to telling the full story of objects on display or in storage. Engaging with these debates is important. So there's clear kind of a commitment to telling the histories of where these objects have come from. And this is kind of our baseline for our research, and that's why I felt it was quite important to share this with you. So, our research objectives. We are looking to critically examine the extent to which colonial narratives persist in shaping the V&A's museum curatorial kind of practices and representational practices. Additionally, we're investigating how decolonial strategies and exhibitions practices are being implemented to reframe and challenge the inherent colonial displays within the museum, and to kind of focus on key stakeholders such as museum practitioners and audiences to understand what are their perceptions and responses to current museological and exhibition strategies. And lastly, through these three objectives, we're hoping to come up with a more collaborative and inclusive mechanism to curations of the South Korean and Chinese cultural heritage in the UK, particularly for UK museums. And this is to facilitate a renewed approach to decolonisation discourse and practice. So in terms of how we're going to go about this, so I've included our funder there, so our funding title, so it's Korean Heritage Research Grants for Early Career Scholars. And the way in which we've chosen to go about this is by taking on a cultural discourse analysis and combining this with archival investigation, kind of site observations, and semi-structured interviews with museum professionals, particularly from the V&A and other institutions, as well as museum academics as well. So this is the point where we're at. So we've done obviously the ideation, the methodology and funding, literature review. We have analysed the V&A's decolonisation strategy, which is what I just shared with you, and we have done an online collection analysis, which is what Hal will shortly be sharing with you. We have done our interim reports in November and have collected and analysed the exhibits, the Korean and Chinese exhibits, which is also something that we're going to share, as well as interviews with museum staff and academics. And essentially we're at this point, we're at this stage of our project. So we're hoping to complete a data analysis and share our findings shortly at some point and think about the dissemination of our project.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Melanie, for your very insightful contextualization of the project. So in the following slides, I'll be briefly introducing some of the key findings and insights that emerged from our analysis of V&A's and their East Asian collection, focusing on China and Korea, based on their online presence, so which primarily including their digital archive and also the highlighted collections in their official website and also their official guidebook as the key material. So first of all, the very first layer of key findings that derives from our online material analysis is called institutional collection taxonomy. So to understand that, just give you guys a brief intro and contextualization. In 1970, the V&A established a dedicated Far Eastern section, and this move consolidated objects from China, Korea, and Japan, which had previously been scattered across various materials-based departments like ceramics and metalwork, which into one cultural and regional-based unit. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the department was primarily known as the Far Eastern Department, which is a very interesting term. And it was not until 2002 the term Far East was officially dropped in favor of the establishment of Asian Department. And this shift was actually part of the modernizing effort to move away from a Eurocentric Orientalist language. But it is still very interesting to see that this kind of geographical-based term or taxonomy has still more or less sustained so far, even in 2026, in V&A's naming strategy of their collections. So one of the key examples here we could observe is their use of the term East Asian collection to capture most of Korean and China's cultural objects, rather than distributed across the museum's broader disciplinary departments, which are categorized by the type of the artifacts. And this kind of segmentation based on region, that may looks quite intuitive and understandable at very first glance, but it's interesting to see that there's no such category called the European collection, for instance. So in this sense, we find it's very interesting. We tend to argue that this kind of unequal institutional typology has more or less sustained a kind of Eurocentric assumption that cultures derived from the UK and the European context are largely assumed to be something universalized and globalized and normalized. But cultures originated from the rest of the world, especially from the global south or the Asia in context, they're largely representing something local, something distant, something exotic, which cannot be detached from their geographical or regional based identity. And the second key finding here is the quantity of the objects. So this finding is primarily derived from our very brief quantitative analysis of their digital archive of Korea and Chinese collections. So Korean collections in V&A has got more than 2,000 objects. But for the Chinese one, it's much larger. It's more than 15,000. It's one of the most comprehensive collections outside of China in Europe. So we definitely understand that that too may not be quantitatively comparable directly, but the key idea here is not to compare the two, but to look into whether V&A's, their representation of cultural objects from East Asian context, reveal a problematic or partial image or understanding for both nations, for these national cultures. And very interestingly, we find that for the Chinese case, there is a few specific cultural categories that have actually dominated V&A's, their Chinese collections overall, which are porcelain and ceramics, very expectedly, right? And even more radically, more than half of the Chinese items currently being displayed in V&A's physical place, they are porcelain and ceramics as well. So reasons of this could be varied, could be multi-layered, could be quite historically complicated. But given the historical complexity, the problem is we're questioning that if audiences, mostly international visitors or local communities or Chinese visitors, Korean visitors, or these source communities, are they aware of the historical complexities? So based on our field trip and also our investigation of their online presence, we don't find out any substantial evidence showcasing or substantial information showcasing that they are reminding the reasons behind this. So as a result, this kind of disproportional representation of cultural styles and categories may more or less contribute to the reproduction of a partial understanding of national culture of China. And at the same time, we also recognize that similar situations, similar issues may emerge in the case of Korea as well, but due to the limited quantity of the Korean artifacts, we currently withhold the argument in this case. And also, the third layer of key finding is what we termed imagined national cultures. So basically, in addition to the quantitative analysis, we have also analyzed a total of 12 Korean and 20 Chinese cultural objects featured in the collection highlights section of V&A's official website, as well as the official guidebook sold in the museum's bookshop, the store. A primary assumption here is that we assume items been included in these mostly visible materials, they are the cultural symbols that this public institution believe can best represent the country, can best represent the national cultures. But very unfortunately, in the Korean case, those traditionally perceived important or significant cultural objects by the source community, such as the folding screens, the paintings, they remain more or less missing, consistently absent from the official narrative, which essentially creates a kind of partial image of Korea. And for the Chinese case, it's even more interesting to see that most of the highlighted Chinese collections, they're actually derived from the imperial patronage, elite craftsmanship, and highlighting the historical heaviness, which focusing on narrating the ancient part, the historical part of China, which creates an image of China as a civilization defined by antiquity, history, old, refinement, or hierarchy. So this is an obvious lack of, or at least insufficient kind of cultural narratives which focuses too much on, which neglect the contemporary aspect of the national culture of China. And finally, it's about the provenance. I think I won't elaborate too much on this respect because Melanie, she will be introducing more on this part. But what I wish to highlight is that V&A has actually made substantial efforts in doing provenance research, and many of the practitioners and professionals, they're quite aware of the issue of provenance transparency. However, based on our examination of their provision of provenance information, we found this process is still very much incomplete. So for instance, even for those highlighted and obviously controversial cultural objects, provenance research is mostly restricted by tracing these items, their historical trajectory within the European circulation, right? And in many cases, and sometimes remains silent, remains overlooked in terms of how, where, in which methods that these items were departed, were sent from the original country. And another issue is the language used to describe these obviously controversial items. For instance, the Qing throne. I would assume some of you may know this item more or less. So obviously this one was quite controversial and obviously ethically problematic. But it's interesting to see that V&A, they tend to use those kind of seemingly quite neutral words to describe their acquisition history. So for instance, they've used the words brought, acquired, took, right? And the only negative word that has been mentioned in the narrative I can see is the verb invaded. So this has been mentioned once only throughout its narrative of acquisition history. So depending on your perspective, I mean, different people may have different perspectives on this. But we tend to argue that this kind of superficially neutral words are actually not superficial in its nature, because it risks mitigating or downplaying the historical burden of the Western colonial powers that are supposed to take, and also downplays the cultural justice, accountability discourse, and overlooked victimhood or the potentially significant cultural, social, economic consequences of colonial power that has brought to the source communities. Right.
Thank you, Hal, for that.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. So,
Yeah.
I'm building on that. So, this analysis that we saw online kind of sips into the physical space of the V&A. So, we have done a study of the Chinese and the Korean exhibits, where we found, again, as Hal has mentioned, it is a very extensive collection and a very archaic collection. And the types of understandings that we gain from it is that there is a very kind of idealized perception of China. There is almost a very distant understanding of China, because there is so much emphasis on the historical context. And while there is a contextualized curatorial approach, meaning that they organize objects and collections around function, use, or design, at the same time we see, and not like kind of a dynastic or historical kind of curatorial approach, at the same time we see that the themes, there is kind of a perpetuation of certain themes such as craftsmanship, rituals and religions. So there is, particularly in times and specific exhibits, specific objects, we see there is a clear tension between by who is this collection created, for who, and who are the curators. There are these questions that come to mind. There is clear tension between a Western and an East Asian representation, which is expected to a degree by a Western kind of national museum, but at the same time there is a question of, are you showing this for a Chinese audience, an international audience, or a British audience? And this is something that comes through in the interviews that curators highlight as a challenge that they are facing. And one of the examples that they kind of highlight is, well, we include Chinese language in the description. So this was something that they highlighted as being inclusive, as being considerate of the source community. And this isn't, I'm highlighting that this isn't necessarily presented in the Korean exhibit. So for the Korean exhibit, as Hal has mentioned, it's significantly smaller. And because of this, we see a lot more emphasis on contemporary artworks as a workaround to this. So the representation that we see that comes out of the Korean exhibit is a lot more recent. And there's almost kind of a diminishment of the historical archaic historical heritage of Korea, which is a stark contrast to the Chinese exhibit. And we see representations offer a much more richer reflections, and this is because there are a lot more kind of descriptive narratives attached to these objects, and we see that there is a much more contemporary Korean identity being created. So there's emphasis on the collective memory and collective identity. So overall, within this curatorial approach, it's a lot more social. And there is some mention of the political conflict, yet this is quite calculated. So while it is acknowledged, it's quite carefully and deliberately limited. So what are some of the positive efforts that we have seen in terms of decolonisation? And this is particularly focusing from this point onwards, I'm going to be speaking about interview findings. So we see a provenance curator, which isn't necessarily something that's often seen. The interviews highlighted this as a really big contribution to the museum. There is a provenance team, and they focus on areas of kind of preventative, reactive, and proactive. The interviews also highlighted that overall in the past 5 to 10 years, there has been a massive shift and focus from the museum to focus on provenance histories. And we see clear guidelines being mentioned, particularly around Nazi-looted objects. For kind of colonial collections, there is some mention of efforts, particularly focusing on African kind of collections, yet this is a lot more distorted in how they are responding. We also see that there is an Art Asian program, and within this, interviewees spoke how they do acknowledge provenance of objects, yet this is not at all kind of really addressed within the physical kind of space, exhibition space of the museum. Museum staff also highlighted that they have a decolonisation staff and network, and they were quite proud of this, how they often would meet up and talk about it. Yet one museum staff also highlighted, well, who's actually being a part of that collective? Is it still a Eurocentric kind of approach to it? From what scripts are they looking at? Where is this forms of knowledge coming from? And we also see the curatorial cultural backgrounds changing, meaning for example, the Chinese collection, we see in the last 30 years, there has been a massive change. So we see that it's now run by all Chinese curators. And this is kind of referenced as something positive by interviewees. And one of the decolonisation kind of actions that they referenced to was introducing Chinese language into the cataloguing records. So how the fact that by rearranging things and collections based on the inside knowledge of the Chinese language made a difference. Yet they also highlighted that just because they're Chinese curators, it doesn't automatically mean that they see China in the same way. So there is a level of critical understanding of their position. And we see professional links with institutions in Asia as well. So some of the constraints that we have come across, museum staff spoke how the gallery texts are inevitably limiting, meaning that there's not enough space, particularly when it comes to contextualizing controversies of objects, which is what Hao kind of mentioned, and they often referenced the online exhibit, and they said, well, there's limited space to include the object's biographies. They also highlighted how there is a limit to the museum exhibition space. So we see here the Korean exhibit is in one of the corridors of the V&A, and this was extensively referenced as being problematic by curators because it is really challenging to create cohesive narratives, curatorial narratives. This actually is a fresh photo. My sister was there the other day, so we managed to get a good photo of it. In terms, the other issue that they spoke about was the economic challenges, meaning around the early 2000s, museum professionals and staff spoke how the museum, the V&A, was going through a difficult situation, and so there was a turn towards temporary exhibits. Yet, this means that a lot of the temporary permanent exhibits haven't been renewed in 30 to 25 years. So it means that when we were asking them around questions on decolonisation, they were referencing the temporary exhibits. They also spoke about limited knowledge about objects, which is what Hal touched upon. So in terms of the historical provenance of objects, the biographies, there is occasions where there's limited information. So particularly for the Korean exhibit, a lot of the objects have been obtained through auctions. So there is also limitations to the collections. So, for example, for the Chinese, overemphasis on porcelains, or for the Korean, we see a lack of objects. So a lot of the time they use contemporary artworks as a workaround. So in terms of the renewal of permanent collections, we see for the Korean gallery, renewal is kind of refreshment of the exhibit, strongly relies on external sponsorship. So in the past, a lot of the objects that are included are either gifts from artists or purchased by, funded by Samsung. And currently the museum, the V&A, is going through a refurbishment of the Korean exhibit. This is, we've found out, in collaboration with the Korean National Museum, which suggests that there is clear connections between the Korean government and involvement in this. This isn't necessarily reflected in the Chinese gallery. So we see for the Chinese gallery, there's renewal or objects have been included in the collection through funding from a Hong Kong collector. Yet impact and contribution from mainland China has largely been limited for obvious reasons. So the ethics around Western museums particularly. But what was quite revealing in one of the quotes that we got was that perhaps the picture of China is very biased. Additionally, they highlighted how if they had the money, they would do things differently. They would include the history of collections, and they would kind of share honest, kind of be more honest regarding what's there and what's not. So we've also focused on the refurbishment of the Korean gallery, where we found that this is to be renovated by December 2026, and they're planning to include a section critically examining the museum's historical framing of Korea, which is a positive, and we see colonial era collecting practices also being considered to be included. Curators also highlighted that they've spoken and reached out to Korean communities of the diaspora and students and multi-generational audiences. So again, there is some consideration to see how these narratives represent people from Korea. What was interesting was that older participants preferred to avoid colonial and war themes, whereas for younger audiences, there was a demand for transparency, so inclusion of the colonial histories and the Korean War. So we see for this renovation, there is an overall promise in acknowledging the complexities of collections' histories. So kind of summing up, we see that staff overall demonstrated the tensions at play, meaning it wasn't necessarily their unwillingness to do more, to act on their kind of this transparency, but they were quite overwhelmed, overworked and under-resourced, which is expected to a degree, but considering that it is a national museum, we weren't quite expecting it to this level. They also rejected the idea, then they were quite adamant that they are not hiding information. Museums aren't hiding information. Rather, they spoke of this transparency that, and often referenced the online database. They also highlighted the fear of backlash, which is becoming more and more of a thing. So they highlighted that anything that they do, anything new that they do, any new forms of communication that they have is under the microscope, so there is the reputational risk of the museum. So whatever we post may trigger backlash. And they particularly reference the Chinese audiences, how they can carry prior assumptions that Western museums mistreat Chinese heritage. So I thought that was quite interesting in terms of that might be an external reason in hindering their approach to decolonisation. So we see overall some of our preliminary conclusions is that representations of displays often reproduced oversimplified characteristics such as an imagined China or imagined Korea, which is framed through broader East Asia cultural traditions, which is what Hao kind of elaborated on. We see insufficient transparency around provenance, as acquisition records occasionally exposed overlooked or ethically ambiguous histories. And we see institutional limitations such as resource constraints and limited exhibition renewal that hinder sustained decolonial engagement. These challenges are moderated by factors such as participants' self-awareness, institutional agendas of decolonisation, shortage of funding sources, and competing expectations of global audiences. And kind of wrapping up, there is a level of kind of understanding these limitations, but at the same time, there is a pending question: to what degree are institutions like the V&A hiding behind these limitations and refusing to relinquish their authority and power to the people and to source communities? Because essentially, if they do that, they will be opening Pandora's box. Thank you.